The church deacon says his pastor stole his wife.
He lusted after her.
He says the pastor controlled his life for years, forcing him to sleep in his basement. The pastor denies it. He has harsh words for the retired deacon.
A fellow who would allow an outsider to send him to the basement would be a wimp.
You're going to be hearing a whole lot more from the two men that you just saw in that beginning clip. We're going to be talking today about the founding of the Independent Baptist Fundamentalist Church, or the IBF cult, as I call him, the one that I grew up in. This man's name is Jack Hyles, and he is the OG of Christian grift and greed. His life story is full of master manipulation and pretty much breaking every single one of the 10 Commandments. But the story that's going to blow your mind is the story that I'm going to tell, and many more stories outside of that, but the main one is the story of Jack Hyles and one of his parishioners named Victor Nischik, who you saw in the video, and his wife, Jenny. And this tale is one of the wildest ones you've ever heard. And that is really a high bar when we're talking about Christian pastor antics, right? So who was Jack Hyles? And I say was because he died in 2001. But here's just a brief story of the brief beginnings of his life. He was born in the 1920s in a little poverty-stricken town south of Dallas called Italy, Texas. I've never heard of Italy, Texas, but he often describes how poor his upbringing was and how distant and cold his father was. At the age of 18, he enlisted in the Army, and he was a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division during World War II. And during the war, he married his wife, Beverly, and they had 4 children, 2 of which are David and Linda. And you'll be hearing from David and Linda later, especially David. After the war, Hyles actually went to college. He went to East Texas Baptist University, and then he started preaching in a whole bunch of small churches in Texas. And he had a real knack for growing these churches. He must have been very charismatic, as grifters and manipulators often are. His claim to fame started in Garland, Texas, where he pastored the Miller Road Baptist Church for about 6 years. And during that time, he brought the congregation from 44 souls up to 4,000. So that's quite a bit when you think about it, right? A small little church of 44, and he made that into 4,000 members. It was during this time, though, that Hyles decided to leave the Southern Baptist Convention and become an independent Baptist, his own church. So that's kind of the beginnings of where this manipulation starts. In 1959, for reasons that I'm not clear on, he left Texas and moved to Hammond, Indiana, which is in northwest Indiana near Chicago. Coincidentally, my husband grew up there. He said he'd never heard of this guy, so I don't know, but my husband was Catholic, so I don't know. But anyway, he moved there and became the head pastor of the First Baptist Church of Hammond. This was an affluent church. At this time, the steel industry was going gangbusters. And this is near Gary, Indiana, between Gary, Indiana, and Chicago. And this was in a very affluent area. The church had about 700 members. And once they heard Hyles, some of them really liked him, but a good chunk of them, about a third of them, left the congregation. I would say wisely. They must have had like a little, a little bird on their shoulder that told them to get the hell out of there. The First Baptist Church of Hammond was in the American Baptist Convention. And Hyles, just like he did in Texas, he took this church from the American Baptist Convention and made them an independent Baptist church. And he is one of the very first people, maybe this one who invented this, the bus ministry. Now, I went to a really tiny independent Baptist church. We didn't have even a car, let alone a bus. But some of these big churches, and they still do it today, they will send out buses throughout the community to pick people up and bring them in. So he started this. And by 1969, he was recognized as having one of the biggest churches in America and definitely the biggest Sunday school. Through his bus ministry, Jack Hyles ended up growing this church from only a few hundred members to over 20,000 members. And so by the 1990s, he was recognized as maybe the first megachurch. Now, megachurches are a dime a dozen, but back then it wasn't that common to have, churches with just thousands and thousands of people. So he was one of the very first ones. By the early 1990s, a national survey ranked the First Baptist Church as the largest church in the nation by weekly attendance. In 1972, Hyles added on to the church by co-founding the Hyles-Anderson Bible College. I'd never heard of this college before, but apparently it became a large college, Bible college in the Midwest, but he refused to have it accredited. And his reasoning was that he thought that he would not have enough control over the Bible college if it was ever accredited. And that is just scratching the surface of the control and narcissism that Jack Hyles possessed in running his church and his school. So let's get into the double life of Mr. Jack Hyles. If you didn't grow up in an independent Baptist church, you have to understand something, that the pastor is an island of his own. He's the leader of the church. And although there's a board of deacons that technically is in charge of hiring and firing them, often what happens is these churches become a cult of personality, and the deacons become under the control of these pastors. And because of this, the way that these are set up, they often, I'm not going to say often, I'm going to say sometimes, they get sociopaths and manipulators to head these churches. And that's how they end up going completely off the rails, because the interpretation of the Bible is theirs. Say what you want about the Southern Baptists or American Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians. They have some control over what their pastors do, and they can censor them and even defrock them. It doesn't happen in the independent Baptist church. And nobody was better at this than Jack Hyles. Of course, he taught the standard, very conservative theology that the women are always submissive to their wives. That's, goes without saying. But he was also especially cruel to children. He thought that they should be completely submissive to every adult, and that they should be seen and not heard, beaten and controlled. So I want you to listen to what this woman, her name is Sharon Maxwell, I found her on TikTok. She grew up in his church, she went to his school, and she went to his college. So I want you to hear what she has to say.
You see, I was raised in the independent fundamental Baptist cult and was not taught science. I was taught creationism, and I was taught how to fight, refute, rebut anything that had to do with real world science. My name's Sharon. Here's part of my story and how it relates to current events in the U.S. Within the IFB, we firmly believed that accreditation would be allowing the government to come into schools and to essentially push demonic and satanic influences and ideologies on the children, which would then not allow them to stay on the path towards God and stay committed and loyal to the church. As such, we were unaccredited, as was our college. However, we grew up believing that our education was elite. We were told repeatedly that the public school kids should be jealous that they don't get the education that we get. However, when I got out of the IFB, I was completely dumbfounded with my ignorance, my lack of knowledge of common knowledge things.
But his manipulations went so far beyond just women and children. His board of deacons was completely under his control, as were the employees of the church and the teachers of the school. Every account that I've read, everything I've read on this guy, and it's not too hard, just Google him and you'll find all this stuff. I will link my sources below in the description so you can check them out for yourself. But by every account, he had, like I said, had complete control over his deacons, associate pastors, employees, church members. In fact, his associate pastor once bragged that he would drink poison if Hyles told him to. And with his deacons, when he would have them gathered, he would continually tell them to stand up and sit down, stand up and sit down, stand up and sit down, solely so that he could show the power that he had over them. One of his deacons said that he would jump off a bridge if Hyles told him to, and Hyles would often brag about that his deacons would jump off a bridge if he told him to, if he told them to. Remember Jack Hyles' children, David and Linda. Here's Linda, and this is in her own words what she had to say about him. I'll put her words up on the screen. She says, every member was in complete obedience to my father. They didn't dare disagree or be disloyal for fear of being publicly ridiculed, punished, or banished for doing so. They didn't go on a vacation without asking my dad's permission. And if he had said to drink the Kool-Aid, I'm not kidding, they would have. Hyles also bragged on himself many occasions. He considered himself the pastor of pastors and the bastion of American conservative ideology. I'm going to just show you a couple of quotes that he had in national magazines. He said, just think how much destruction would happen to America and churches if I quit. He said, America needs me. First Baptist Church in Hammond is the greatest church in the New Testament age. Who does that remind you of? I'm not going to say. You tell me in the comments who you think that reminds you of. Oh, but it gets worse, much worse. Now we're going to go into the tale of Victor and Jenny Nischik. Now, Victor had a good job in Detroit with General Motors, but he decided to quit General Motors and move to Hammond, Indiana, so that he could attend the First Baptist Church of Hammond. Even his own father, who was a pastor himself, was very unhappy with this, and he practically disowned his son for doing this. But Victor just idolized Jack Hyles and wanted to be a part of his church. By his own admission, Victor says that he practically worshipped Jack Hyles. He almost considered him a deity. So he got rid of his job or quit in General Motors in Detroit, moved to Hammond, and he started working at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago full-time. Keep that in mind because that's a little bit important later on. But he also spent all of his free time working at the church for Jack Hyles. He was the choir director for multiple years. He sang in the choir. He helped teach Sunday school. He helped run the bus ministry. You name it, he was doing it, worshiping at Hyles' feet. So when Hyles came to Victor and said, I really could use your wife in the office to help me out. I'm going to have her mail out my cassette tapes of my sermons. Would you let her do that? He was asking his permission because that's what you had to do. The wife couldn't decide, the husband did. He was thrilled. So Victor and Jenny decided she would go work in the office, even though they had some small children, to help them out. And that's just what seemed like the dream to them. Now they are absolutely living the dream. But it didn't take Victor too long to start noticing that Jenny was being a little cold and distant to him. And by the early 1970s, Jenny decided she was not going to be with her husband anymore. And I don't mean separated, I mean not be with him. So here's where things take a really crazy and wild turn. About the same time, like I said, in the early 1970s, after not being with her husband for quite some time, she surprised Victor by saying that she wanted a divorce and that he had 24 hours to get out of town. Now, Victor is flabbergasted, and of course he refuses. He's not going to be leaving town. So Jenny decides she's going to call Pastor Jack over and have him talk to her husband. And so the Pastor Jack says, yes, you need to leave town, and I'm going to pay for you to relocate to Denver. And Victor was having none of it. He didn't want to move to Denver. He loved his wife. He didn't want to leave his children. And he had a job at Moody Bible Institute. So he was going to stay put. So this did not go over very well with Jenny and Jack. And they decided that they were going to continue to try and pressure him. In the meantime, Victor decides wisely that something must be going on. So he ended up gathering a lot of evidence, and he ended up getting some evidence that, of course, Jenny and Jack were having an affair. Now, that's not that shocking. We've seen pastor after pastor having affairs. Whatever, you're thinking, Laurentia, so what? This is just another little story about a pastor having an affair. No, it's not, because this is where it really takes a wild turn. So Jack and Victor and Jenny have another meeting about 3 days later. And Victor surprises the two of them with his evidence. And he doesn't ever say what it was. I don't know what his evidence was of the affair between Jack and Jenny. And suddenly, Jack does a whole 180. He gets very scared and he starts begging Victor to stay, to keep helping with the church, to stay for his children. But he decides that he doesn't want Victor sleeping with or even talking to Jenny. So this is what Jack has Victor do. I'm going to put this up on a graphic. So this is what they worked out. They continued to live in the same house, but they did not see, speak, or eat together, or ride in the same automobile, or even contact one another in any way, except for an hour or so on Christmas, exchanging gifts with the children. A schedule was even worked out about when each parent could be with the children, one that was rigidly followed. So for reasons that I can't quite understand, Victor decided to go along with this. And what he did is he moved a roll-away bed into his basement, and he lived there for 12 years, still working at the church, still working at the Moody Bible Institute, seeing his wife and children for 1 hour on Christmas to exchange gifts, and not even riding in an automobile with his own wife. And this continued for 12 years. I'm only guessing that he was so brainwashed and manipulated by Jack Hyles that this is what he thought he had to do. Now, the other thing is that he worked at the Moody Bible Institute, and they forbid anyone who was divorced from working at their Bible college. So he also had that going on. Well, at about 1983, he's getting sick. He's living in this moldy, damp basement, and he's getting sick. So he goes to Jack Hyles, Victor does, and says, I'm moving back upstairs with Jenny, and that's that. And Victor, I guess he finally decided to assert some kind of manhood, a little too late if you ask me, but this is what he did. And Jack said, no, you're not going to do that. We're going to build you a room above the garage, and this is where you're going to live. So out of his own pocket, Jack Hyles paid $11,000. This is in 1983. That was quite a bit of money in 1983 for Jack Hyles just to shovel out of his own pocket. But I'm assuming he's making a boatload of money, and we'll talk about that later, where money comes into it, for Victor to go live in this garage, this room above the garage. But here's the kicker. Jack Hyles demanded that Victor pay Jenny rent for living in his own house. So Victor had to fork over about $300 a month to live in the room above his own garage. So this is the arrangement they have. I don't understand it. I don't think anyone can fathom that type of manipulation. But I got to give it to Victor. That didn't last very long. A few years later, he went to Jack Hyles and said, you're going to terminate this affair with my wife. Jack absolutely refused and decided that he was going to have Jenny go ahead and divorce Victor. So this is what happened. They ended up getting a divorce. Jack kind of manipulated and massaged the whole thing, got 2 attorneys. He got the attorneys for Jenny and Victor, and they ended up going to court. And so this is where a lot of this came out. And in fact, Victor's own attorney asked him, who made you live in the basement? And who made you live in the garage? And Victor said, Hyles did. He made me do it. Here's the thing though, until the bitter end, even when they were in court, Victor was refusing to get the divorce. He even cross-petitioned, tried to get it done, but even then in Indiana state law, it only took one party, and that would be Jenny, to terminate the marriage. So she did, and they finally were divorced in 1986 or 1987. And so poor Victor was without his house, without his wife, without his children, but he did keep his job. So Moody Bible Institute, once they looked into the whole thing, they completely exonerated Victor and they let him keep his job as the only divorced person on their staff. So I can kind of see why I'm no fan of Moody Bible Institute, but they did the right thing in this case. I want you to read what Victor's attorney said. He said, "I might add that in 20 years of practice, I do not recall any other case where an individual like Vic has taken the steps he did to preserve his marriage, such as living in a basement for 12 years and then building a dormer to appease his wife and stay in the marital home." There's still so much more to this story, but this episode is getting really long. I'm going to make a part 2. I'll put them out together. So I'll link part 2 in the description, or I'll link it right here too. So you can go to part 2 and learn more about their Jenny and Jack's decades-long affair, more about that. You'll learn more about his probably affairs with other women, his tax evasion and money grifting. We'll also learn more about Jack Hyles' son, David, and his son-in-law, who was married to Linda, and how one of them ended up in jail. So stay tuned for part 2, and I will see you there.